In the year 1900 before Christ, in a fertile valley east of the Dead Sea, two cities rose like shining jewels in the heart of the desert: Sodom and Gomorrah. Their towers gleamed under the sun, their streets overflowed with music, wine, and pleasure. There was no modesty, no law. Luxury was the norm. Indulgence was a virtue. The name of God was nothing more than a fading echo in the memories of the old. But the sin of these cities did not remain hidden. From every injustice, every abuse, every act of cruelty, a cry rose up to heaven, and heaven answered. The earth shook. The air turned to fire, and from above, judgment fell. Flames like tongues of wrath descended from the sky. Burning sulfur consumed the homes, the temples, the palaces. The towers split in two, the walls melted like clay, and the ground itself opened to swallow every trace of life. No stone was left upon another. No scream remained unanswered. No ruins, no remains, no graves, only ashes and silence. Thus vanished Sodom and Gomorrah, wiped from the face of the earth by the judgment of the Most High. To this day, no one can say with certainty where they once stood. Only the desert dust keeps their secret. And even now, millennia later, humanity still wonders, what did those people do to deserve such a punishment? What really happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? This is their story. Water flowed down from the mountains, forming rivers that wound through the plains like veins of silver. The breeze, rich with the fragrance of wildflowers, swept across golden wheat fields, swaying the stalks like a golden ocean beneath the rising sun. Fruit trees stood tall with branches heavy with abundance, and vines clung to stone walls, swelling with grapes that burst with sweetness at the slightest touch. The lands of the Jordan were a paradise, a lush garden stretching as far as the eye could see. Thriving cities rose amid that abundance, their streets paved with carved stone, their squares bustling with merchants offering foreign silks, fragrant spices, and gold shaped by skillful hands. In the markets, traders called out their wares with confident voices, while musicians played lyres and flutes to delight those passing by. In the palaces, oil lamps cast a warm glow over endless feasts, where nobles laughed with goblets raised, their hands adorned with rings. The people flourished, harvests never failed, and the flocks multiplied without end. The city walls rose in arrogance, defying both the desert and time itself. Nothing seemed to threaten their greatness. But beneath that appearance of glory, something else was growing in the shadows. Something no walls, no wealth, no abundance could contain. The sun bathed the towers of Sodom in golden light, reflecting off marble rooftops and crystal-clear fountains that adorned the city's squares. The streets were crowded with merchants offering vibrant fabrics, exotic perfumes, and precious stones brought from distant lands. Caravans arrived laden with gold and spices, and the sound of coins changing hands echoed through the markets. The banquets were endless. Tables covered with delicacies stretched across the palaces of the powerful, where wine flowed without limit, and music rose between alabaster columns. In every corner of the city, abundance filled the air. For many, life in Sodom meant a carefree existence, without lack, without worry, without restraint. But beyond the towering walls, beneath the gleaming surface, something dark was growing unchecked. Wealth fed arrogance, and abundance smothered compassion. Strength triumphed over justice, and cruelty had become the norm. Strangers were met with disdain. The poor were stripped of what little they had without remorse. And corruption flowed through the streets like an unstoppable river. There was no law greater than the will of the powerful. There was no restraint for the most unbridled desires. Each day brought new excesses, and each night ended with acts no one dared to question. In Sodom, pleasure knew no bounds, and punishment seemed like a forgotten idea. But the heavens were not silent. Something unseen was moving over the city, something none of its inhabitants could have imagined. The gates of Sodom opened at dawn, and with the light of day came the roar of a city that never slept. Merchants hurried to set up their stalls. Judges took their seats in the courts. Musicians tuned their instruments, and banquet halls prepared for yet another celebration. Every street was alive with movement. Every square echoed with voices of joy. But beneath that appearance of normalcy, corruption had taken root so deeply that no one even noticed it anymore. Justice was sold to the highest bidder. Compassion was seen as foolishness, and truth had become a nuisance few were willing to tolerate. There were no limits to ambition, no restraint on pleasure. The strong crushed the weak without consequence, and greed drove every decision. The elders spoke of a God who once ruled over the earth, but their words were met with laughter. It was said that in ancient times there were laws that brought balance, and that men once walked under the gaze of the Most High. But now, those stories sounded absurd, distant, completely disconnected from the reality of a city governed by its own rules. Temples once built with devotion lay in ruins, or had been turned into banquet halls. Prayers had become forgotten echoes, and what was once sacred was now trampled without remorse. Morality carried no weight, conscience was an obstacle, and reverence for the divine had vanished. The nights unfolded with the same wild abandon that ended each day. In Sodom, every desire was fulfilled, every impulse fed, every boundary erased. The city laughed in arrogance, never imagining that in heaven, judgment was already on its way. Night stretched over Sodom like a cloak of restless shadows. The streets, lit by flickering torches, bore witness to drunken laughter and whispers lost between stone walls. In the squares, feasts carried on without pause, and in the palaces, wine spilled over floors covered in luxurious tapestries. The noise never ceased. Pleasure, greed, and violence ruled the city. From the nearby hills, the glow of Sodom looked like an eternal flame. A city that never slept, a kingdom of men who had built their own throne without fear. There was no shame in their actions, no repentance in their hearts. Right and wrong had lost all meaning. The only law was the will of the strongest. But while men celebrated, something unseen rose above the towers and markets. Something no feast could silence. Something no wealth could buy. A cry not spoken with human lips, yet louder than any shout from the crowd. From every act of injustice, from every abuse of power, from every betrayal, from every cruelty, an echo rose and crossed the heavens. On earth, the oppressors laughed, the innocent suffered in silence, and the arrogant believed themselves untouchable. But in the heights, nothing went unnoticed. The city lived convinced that judgment would never come, that its splendor was eternal, not its sin, that abundance was a right, not a gift, that the sacred could be trampled without consequence. But the cry did not stop, and in heaven, something began to stir. The wind swept over the hills of Canaan, stirring the sand into swirling patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. Beneath the shade of an oak tree, an old man with a weathered face watched the horizon. His eyes, full of stories, had seen the glory of kings, the fury of the desert, and the promise of a land he did not yet possess. His name was Abraham. He had walked long distances, crossed mighty rivers, and slept beneath star-filled skies, guided by a voice that had called him to leave everything behind. He carried no maps, no deeds to secure his future. His only certainty was the word of the one who had spoken from above, promising that his descendants would be as countless as the dust of the earth. Shepherds tended their flocks on the hillsides, while the tents of his camp stood among the rocks. He had wealth, livestock, and servants, but his true inheritance had not yet been revealed. God had told him he would be the father of nations, yet the years passed, and his wife Sarah remained barren. Still, he did not doubt. He did not complain. He did not demand answers. He walked in the quiet certainty that the promise would be fulfilled, even when everything seemed to say otherwise. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the fields in gold, 3 figures appeared in the distance. They walked with steady steps, unhurried, showing no signs of weariness. Their robes fluttered in the wind, and though the blowing sand veiled their faces, their presence carried a weight unlike any other. They were not like the merchants passing by with their caravans, nor the travelers seeking water at the wells. Abraham narrowed his eyes and without hesitation rose at once. He ran to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He did not ask their names. He did not question their purpose. His heart told him he must honor them, and he did. He asked his wife to knead fresh bread, commanded his servants to choose a tender calf, and ordered milk and butter to be brought. The travelers took their seats under the shade, and as they ate, Abraham stood beside them in silence, waiting. Then one of them looked up and spoke with a voice that cut through the air like a sharpened blade. What he was about to say was no ordinary message. It was a decree. Something had been decided in heaven, and the fate of an entire city hung on every word that would follow. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the smell of dry grass and warm earth. Within the camp, servants moved back and forth, carrying jars of water and trays of roasted meat. Beneath the shade of the largest oak, 3 men sat, eating calmly. Abraham stood beside them, watching their every move with careful attention. There was something in their posture, in the way they spoke to one another, in the quiet authority they carried, that made the air feel different. They were not ordinary travelers. Every gesture conveyed a presence that needed no introduction. Then one of them looked up and spoke in a firm voice. "Next year, when I return to you, your wife Sarah will have a son." From inside the tent, where she thought no one could see her, Sarah listened and covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Her body no longer held the strength of youth, and the long years of waiting had taught her to accept the impossible. A child at her age was nothing more than a distant thought, something she had learned not to hope for. But the voice spoke again, this time with a tone that left no room for doubt. Why does Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? The entire camp seemed to fall still. The air grew heavier, and the heat of the day pressed harder against the skin. Abraham bowed his head, understanding that these were not words of suggestion or wishful thinking. They were a decree. The travelers finished their meal. Soon they would rise, and their steps would carry them far from that camp. But before they left, they would reveal something else. Something not about life, but about destruction. The wind blew over the hills, lifting dust that mingled with the reddish glow of the sunset. The three visitors rose to their feet, and Abraham walked alongside them. From the heights, the old man's eyes turned toward the Jordan Valley, where the lights of Sodom had begun to flicker to life. The city glowed in the distance, unaware of what was about to be revealed. One of the visitors stopped and fixed his gaze on the horizon. His voice, firm and solemn, broke the silence. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah has reached me, for their sin is very great. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. Abraham felt the weight of those words. His heart stirred. In that land lived Lot, his nephew, with his wife and daughters. They breathed the same air as those wicked men. Would they perish along with them? The old man lifted his eyes and spoke with reverence. Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? The shadows stretched long over the sand. Sodom still gleamed in the distance, lost in its own arrogance. As its people prepared for another night of indulgence, judgment already hovered above them, waiting to descend. The sun dipped below the horizon. The wind changed direction. Two of the visitors resumed their path, descending into the valley. In Sodom, no one imagined that those approaching footsteps were the last the city would ever hear before its destruction. The wind stirred Abraham's robes as he stood before the Lord. Two of the visitors were already descending into the valley, but the old man did not move. He had heard the sentence. Sodom was condemned. The patriarch's face reflected anguish. Lot lived there with his family. Though the city had given itself over to corruption, perhaps there were still righteous people within its walls. Perhaps judgment was not yet inevitable. He took a deep breath and spoke with reverence. Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Perhaps there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you spare the place for the sake of the 50? The Lord's voice rose over the hill. If I find 50 righteous in Sodom, I will spare the whole city for their sake. Abraham lowered his head. He knew what went on in that valley. He knew the pride of its people, the way they mocked justice and trampled the sacred. Perhaps there weren't 50. His voice came softer this time. What if there are 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? The answer came swiftly. If I find 45, I will not destroy it. Abraham felt he must press further. Perhaps there are 40. For the sake of 40, I will not do it. What if there are 30? If I find 30, I will not destroy it. Each time he spoke, his voice grew weaker. It wasn't fear he felt. It was a quiet, growing certainty. Perhaps 20. If I find 20, I will forgive the city. The old man swallowed hard. He knew he had reached the edge. Please, Lord, let me speak just once more. What if there are 10? If I find 10 righteous in Sodom, I will not destroy it. Silence fell over the hilltop. Abraham said no more. His heart understood what his lips could not bring themselves to say. The fate of the city was sealed. The night breeze swept the sand across the hills as Abraham stood still, his eyes fixed on the Jordan Valley. The lights of Sodom glowed in the distance, its fires burning, its squares crowded, its feasts unending. Everything went on as usual. Nothing in the city hinted that judgment was drawing near. But above, where the old man had pleaded for mercy, heaven had fallen silent. The Lord had spoken one final time. "If I find 10 righteous in the city, I will not destroy it." After that, nothing more. Abraham did not insist. He bowed his head and felt the weight of a silence that said more than words ever could. If 10 righteous could be found, the city would be spared. But the messengers were already making their way down into the valley. There had been no declaration of mercy, no sign of reprieve. The wind blew colder. In Sodom, the streets pulsed with the same nightly euphoria. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, music rose above the rooftops. But the countdown had begun, and none within its walls had the slightest idea of what was coming. Abraham turned slowly and walked back to his tent. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The city's fate was already sealed, and for many, dawn would never come. The sun was dying on the horizon when 2 silhouettes emerged on the dusty road. Their steps were steady and unwavering, yet their stride showed no sign of weariness. They did not speak to one another, nor did they glance to either side. They walked with unshakable purpose, as if nothing could turn them from their path. The desert breeze swept sand into swirling patterns that dissolved over the road. In the distance, beyond the river, Sodom rose with its towering walls, its spires bathed in the golden light of twilight. From afar, the city seemed prosperous, brimming with life, its gates open to trade and pleasure. But the appearance was only a veil. Beneath the surface, something far darker pulsed. The 2 travelers moved forward without haste, untouched by the exhaustion the desert road would place on any ordinary man. They carried no provisions, sought no shelter, feared neither thieves nor beasts, for they were no ordinary men. Sodom stretched out before them like a sleeping giant, unaware of the judgment approaching. From atop its towers, the flames of braziers lit the streets, where merchants squeezed the last profits from the day, and revelers gathered for yet another night of indulgence. The city gates were just steps away. The guards saw them, but paid no attention. To them, they were nothing more than weary travelers in search of rest. They did not know those feet carried the last sunset Sodom would ever see. Twilight painted the walls of Sodom in shades of red as Lot sat at the city gate. From that spot, he watched merchants closing their stalls, travelers seeking lodging, and groups gathering in the squares for the first round of wine. He knew the rhythm of these streets well, the constant bustle, and the shadows that came alive as the sun finished its course. His eyes scanned the faces with the attentiveness of one who knows that each day is a battle between prudence and resignation. Years earlier, when he had chosen to settle in this land, he had seen it through different eyes. Its fertility and wealth had seemed like promises of prosperity. He had not imagined that such abundance could conceal a trap, that corruption would seep into every corner, and that reverence for life would vanish without a trace. Many considered him a respectable man. His words held weight in the courts, and his influence offered him protection. But among the laughter of the youth wandering the streets and the debates of the elders in the square, there were always whispers. "That foreigner who thinks he's a judge," some would murmur. "Living here doesn't make him one of us." Lot took a deep breath and rested his hands on his knees. Night was approaching, and with it, the excesses that no longer surprised him. But something different lingered in the air, something he couldn't yet name. He looked up, and through the crowd, he saw two figures approaching. They were not merchants. They were not thieves. Their robes remained clean despite the dust of the road. Their walk showed no weariness. There was something about them that defied the logic of everything around him. Lot rose immediately. Deep in his soul, he knew these men were not there by chance. The two strangers paused at the entrance to the city. Their faces remained calm, but their eyes seemed to pierce through the walls of Sodom, as if they already knew what awaited them inside. Lot stood before them, a weight pressing against his chest. He had seen countless travelers pass through those gates, but never had he felt this unease, this urgency to act before nightfall fully descended. He bowed respectfully and spoke with firm resolve. "My lords, please come to my house. You can wash your feet and spend the night there. At dawn, you may continue on your way." The travelers looked at each other and answered without hesitation, "We will spend the night in the square." A chill ran down Lot's spine. At sunset, the square became a place without law. It was the setting for feasts where wine flowed without restraint, for spectacles where human dignity was trampled as if it held no value. What began with laughter often ended in stifled cries, in hands grasping at shadows, in acts too vile to name. He couldn't allow it. He stepped forward, raised his hands urgently, and pleaded, "Please, don't do that. Come with me. It is dangerous to remain there." His words were no exaggeration. He knew all too well what happened to lone travelers in Sodom. The strangers looked at him for a moment, then, without further discussion, nodded. Lot quickly led them to his house and closed the door behind them. The city carried on with its night as always, unaware of what was about to unfold. The door of the house shut firmly behind them. Lot took a deep breath as the echo of the city faded behind the walls. His hands were tense. The strangers had accepted his plea, but the unease did not leave him. The night was just beginning, and in Sodom, nightfall stirred everything into motion. He called for water to wash their feet and asked his wife and daughters to prepare unleavened bread. On the table, he set tender meat, fresh fruit, and milk. The light of the lamps cast soft shadows on the stone walls, and for a moment, inside that small refuge, the noise of the city felt far away. The strangers ate in silence. Their faces were calm, but there was something in their presence Lot couldn't quite grasp. They showed no signs of fatigue, no trace of surprise at their surroundings. It was as if they already knew every corner of the city before even setting foot in it. The flames of the lamps flickered with a gust of wind that slipped in beneath the door. Outside, the murmur of voices grew louder. Laughter, hurried footsteps, whispers multiplying in number. Lot felt a weight on his chest. The danger he had tried to avoid had arrived sooner than expected. A sharp knock echoed against the door, then another, and another still. The wood trembled under the pounding fists, demanding attention. The voices no longer whispered. They now roared with impatience. What had been a place of refuge just minutes before was now the final wall between good and horror. The torchlight cast long shadows across the narrow streets. Laughter and the bustle of the night mingled with the scent of wine and roasted meat. The city gave itself over to its usual rhythm, unaware that this evening would not be like the others. But something had shifted. The eyes of certain men turned toward Lot's house. Strangers, two outsiders, had entered the gates of Sodom at sunset, and they hadn't been seen in the squares or at the feasts. They hadn't joined the songs or the dances, nor had they bought anything in the markets. They had arrived quietly, walking with the confidence of those who fear no one. And now, they were hidden inside that house. The whispers spread quickly. At first, it was just a few. But soon the curiosity grew like a spark caught in the wind. Who were they? Why had Lot taken them into his home? The voices multiplied. Quick footsteps echoed through the alleyways, gathering more people at every corner. Before long, a crowd had formed in the square. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Wine fueled the frenzy. Words turned into shouts, and shouts into demands. The mob surged toward Lot's house like an unstoppable wave. The first stone struck the door, then another, then a fist, then many. "Bring out the men who came to you tonight." The chorus rose with fury. The shadows of Sodom had awakened. The pounding on Lot's door grew louder. The shadows of the men stretched across the walls, twisted by the flickering torchlight swaying in the wind. The voices were no longer whispers or murmurs of suspicion. They were shouts. "Bring them out! Hand them over!" Fists struck the wood with fury, impatient, relentless. This was not a plea for answers or explanations. It was a demand for submission. Inside, Lot felt the weight of the inevitable. His home, once a refuge amid the chaos, was now the only barrier between the crowd and their prey. He swallowed hard, placed his hand on the trembling wood, and turned the latch. Outside, the torches lit faces twisted by impatience and desire. There were merchants, judges, young men, and old. None of them hesitated in what they demanded. "We saw the men who came to your house. Bring them out so we may know them." The words carried intentions that needed no explanation. Lot raised his hands, trying to calm the storm gathering before him. "My brothers, do not commit this wickedness." But his words were lost in the wind, faces contorted into sneers and scorn. "Who are you to judge us? You're a foreigner. You won't tell us what to do." The first feet stepped forward, ready to force their way in. The crowd pushed harder. The flames of the torches shook with the movement. The door was on the verge of giving in. Lot felt the pressure of bodies advancing. The air grew heavy. The moment he had feared for so long had finally come. Footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets, faster now, heavier. Long shadows stretched across the walls, growing with every new torch that was lit. What had started with a few curious onlookers had become a furious mob. No one asked why they were there. No one questioned what they demanded. In front of Lot's house, the first blows made the door tremble. "Bring them out!" The shout thundered like a storm, followed by another, and another still. "We know they're inside." The air was thick with impatience. Eager hands clutched at the wood, ready to break it down if needed. Eyes burned with an uncontrollable desire, reflecting the firelight that lit up the scene. In Sodom, the night always brought excess, but tonight, something darker had seized the hearts of the people. Inside the house, Lot leaned his forehead against the door. His breath was heavy. He knew the nature of his city. He knew the absence of boundaries. It wasn't the first time he'd seen an angry crowd, but never had the danger felt this close. He turned to look at the strangers. They did not move. They showed no fear. They simply waited. Outside, the pressure against the entrance grew. The wood groaned. The mob would not leave empty-handed. Suddenly, a violent jerk pulled him backward. Rough hands grabbed his cloak and dragged him toward the crowd. He stumbled, feeling the heat of the torches near his face, the stench of sweat mingling with smoke. Voices roared around him, each one more hostile than the last. "Get out of the way! You're no one to stop us!" The stone ground scraped his knees as he fell. Hands rose, ready to strike. A fist gripped his hair, yanking it as if he were nothing but an obstacle to be discarded. But then, the door of his house burst open. A rush of air swept through the threshold. Something unseen, yet overwhelming, moved through the crowd, and before the first blow could land on Lot, darkness fell over the city. In an instant, he was yanked with a strength no man could resist. The world spun around him. Suddenly, he was no longer in the dust of the street. He was inside his house, and the hands that had seized him were not human. Before Lot could even understand what was happening, the door slammed shut behind him with a crash that shattered the night. The echo rang through the house, while outside, the crowd stood frozen. The torches flickered. Something was happening. Something no one could explain. Lot turned to look at the strangers. They no longer looked like ordinary travelers. The lamplight shimmered against ageless faces, their eyes fierce and unwavering. The air inside the house felt different, charged with a presence that made the skin tremble. Outside, the first screams of panic broke the silence. The men of Sodom clutched at their eyes. They stumbled, fell, and clung to one another in the sudden total darkness that had swallowed their world. The shouts that had once been filled with rage turned into cries of confusion. Desperate hands reached out into nothing, searching for stability in a world suddenly swallowed by shadow. The men of Sodom were blind. One fell to his knees, rubbing his eyes furiously. Another stretched his arms into the air, as if he could grasp the light that had vanished in an instant. The mob that had roared moments earlier now staggered without direction. Some stumbled over stones, others crashed into each other, spinning aimlessly in a darkness that wasn't in the night, but inside their own minds. "What is this?" one cried, his voice cracking with panic. "I can't see anything." The torches still burned, but their flames held no light for them. The city that had always been theirs was now a maze without exit. The same men who had pounded on Lot's door with arrogance were now clinging to walls like frightened children. Inside the house, Lot looked at the strangers, his breath short and shallow. They hadn't moved a single finger. They hadn't raised their voices or lifted a weapon. The darkness had fallen by a command that needed no words. Outside, the crowd continued to stumble in their own despair. The night was far from over, but their judgment had already begun. Dawn had not yet come, but the night already carried a different weight. Inside the house, the air felt thick, charged with an urgency that could not be ignored. Lot looked at the strangers, who still stood motionless, with the same impenetrable calm they had shown since their arrival. Then one of them spoke, and his voice echoed with an authority that made the walls tremble. "Get up. Take your wife and your daughters who are here. Leave the city now. Do not stay another moment." A chill ran down Lot's spine. Leave? His possessions were there, his home, the life he had built over the years. Outside, the crowd remained in chaos. Men staggering without direction, stumbling over one another, shouting in confusion. But the voice of the angels did not waver. "You will be destroyed with them if you stay." The words struck like thunder. This was no suggestion. This was not a choice. Something far greater than the confusion of the night was on its way. Something that would shake the very foundations of the earth. Lot hesitated. His thoughts tangled with doubt, with memories, with the crushing realization that everything he knew was about to vanish. And then, he felt hands grab him firmly. There was no time left to think. The strangers seized him, his wife and his daughters, pulling them out of the house with a force that allowed no resistance. The door was left behind. The streets of Sodom lay in shadows, but the danger was no longer in the city. The real danger was in looking back. Lot moved quickly through the shadows of the city. The air was still thick with the echoes of screams and the sound of bodies stumbling in the dark. The torches still burned, but for many, they no longer held meaning. Judgment was near, and Sodom remained lost in its arrogance. His daughters were at home, but their fiancés were not. If they stayed, they would perish with the rest. He reached the house where they slept and knocked urgently on the door. Every second was a thin thread between life and death. From inside, slow footsteps approached. The door creaked open just a few inches, enough for two young faces to appear in the dim light. Eyes heavy with sleep, expressions of annoyance. Lot spoke with urgency. "Get up, leave this place. The Lord is going to destroy the city." The two stood silent. First they looked at him, then at each other. Their lips curled into smirks, and within seconds, laughter broke out. "Destroy Sodom? Don't be ridiculous. Nothing's going to happen to us." Their laughter continued. To them, Lot's warning was absurd. Nonsense spoken in the middle of the night. Something inside the old man broke. There was no more time. They could not see the danger looming over them. Lot stepped back. His hands were trembling. His heart felt like stone. He knew what their laughter meant. He knew what was coming. He turned and disappeared into the shadows. Sodom was lost, and they had chosen to remain in it. The first light of dawn struggled to break over the horizon, but the city remained cloaked in an unsettling shadow. It was the final morning of Sodom. Lot left his house in haste, eyes fixed on the ground, heart pounding in his chest. There was no time to lose. The warning of the messengers echoed in his mind. Flee. Don't look back. Don't stop. His wife and daughters followed close behind, faces tense, hands trembling. Everything they had known was behind them. Every street they had walked, every memory, every corner they once called home. But there was no room for mourning now. Only one outcome remained: salvation or death. Behind them, the city still slept. Its people had no idea that their final hours had already passed. The gates remained open, the torches still burned. And inside the homes were those who had laughed the night before, unaware of what was coming. Lot and his family quickened their pace as the sunlight began to streak the sky with red. But this was not the dawn of a new day. It was the herald of an impending judgment. The wind began to blow with a force that made the walls tremble. A distant sound, like an underground roar, rose over the plain. Something unseen was beginning to move in the heights above. Lot did not dare turn his head. He knew the heavens were about to open. The wind whistled through the empty streets. Dawn rose like a burning blade on the horizon. But it carried no hope, only judgment. Lot's breath came in gasps. Cold sweat ran down his brow. Each step was a farewell. Every meter forward pulled him further from everything he had once called home. His daughters ran beside him. His wife followed closely behind. But something heavier than fear hung in the air. One of the angels grabbed his arm with a strength that could not be resisted. "Run! Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will die." The command struck like a stone. There was no turning back, no space for doubt, no room for sorrow. The walls of Sodom lay far behind, but the roar rising from the city signaled that judgment had begun. The ground trembled. A hot, heavy wind surged from the valley like the breath of a buried fire. Time was running out. Lot clenched his teeth and ran. Every part of him screamed not to stop. But behind him, something changed. Footsteps that had once been steady began to falter. A shadow was left behind. His wife's heart was still in Sodom. The wind blew with unusual force, lifting dust and ash along the path. Lot ran, but his mind was a whirlwind. Each step took him farther from Sodom, yet the city still burned in his thoughts. He had been pulled out by force, dragged away from the disaster looming over the valley. He had seen the city's corruption with his own eyes, but his heart still bore the weight of attachment. That was where he had built his life. There remained his friends, his memories, everything he had considered home for so many years. But the home he had known was gone. One of the angels spoke again. His voice carried no anger, no impatience. Only firm warning, laced with compassion. Flee to the mountains. Do not stop. It is your only escape. Panic tightened Lot's throat. The mountains were far. His body was weary, and his wife and daughters could barely stand. If they kept running, could they survive? The words left his mouth without thought. Let me go to that small town. It's close. I can take refuge there and save my life. The angel was silent for a moment. Then, with the same unwavering tone that had pronounced destruction, he replied, "Very well. I grant you this request. Run there, but do not look back." Lot didn't understand why such mercy had been granted. Judgment had already been declared, but even in the midst of wrath, there was still room for mercy. Without another word, he clung to what remained. The town of Zoar was near. He could not stop. He could not doubt. The fire had not yet fallen, but the heavens were already opening. Lot's feet pounded the dry ground in a frantic rhythm. The wind howled, lifting dust and ash, as if the earth itself could sense what was about to unfold. His daughters ran behind him, stumbling over the stones in the path, fear caught in their throats. Zoar wasn't far, a small city on the plain, a final refuge before judgment consumed everything they left behind. But every second was heavy. Every moment lost could seal their fate. The horizon lit up with an orange flash. The sky, once a dark veil, began to glow with an unnatural fire. A deep roar tore through the air, not from beasts or storms, but from something greater, something that had already begun its descent. Lot did not look back. He knew Sodom no longer existed. Thoughts swirled in his mind. His home, his people, his land. Everything he had once known was now nothing but ashes awaiting the final blow. Zoar was close. Just a few more steps, and they would reach the gate. But something changed. One footstep was missing. Lot felt the absence of a shadow beside him. His breath caught in his throat. Horror crawled across his skin. His wife was no longer with him. She had looked back. The ground was trembling. A roar rose in the distance, deep and ominous, as if the earth itself groaned beneath the weight of what was descending from above. Lot ran with his eyes fixed on the horizon. Zoar was close. Just a few more meters, and the shadow of destruction would be behind them. But a chill ran down his spine. Something was missing. The rhythm of footsteps had changed. His wife's breath was no longer beside him. He turned slightly, not stopping completely, the air burning around him. Time seemed to freeze. There, in the middle of the path, his wife stood motionless. Her silhouette, once wrapped in dust and shadow, now stood alone against the growing glow behind them. She had looked back. The wind pulled at her tunic. The air around her thickened. Her hands, stretched out as if trying to grasp what no longer was, stiffened. Her skin turned coarse. Her features froze in an instant of regret. Lot felt the breath shatter in his chest. He wanted to run to her, to reach out and pull her from that fatal moment. But it was too late. Where once there had been a woman, now stood only a rigid white figure. The wind beat against her lifeless form, but she could no longer move. Lot clenched his teeth as a weight beyond words sank into his soul. There was nothing more he could do. The fire was already falling from the sky. The earth was burning behind him. Zoar was only steps away, but the loss would follow him forever. The wind changed. The air was no longer the same. It had become thick, saturated with an impossible heat. Over the valley, the sky turned a sickening shade of red, as if the sun itself had descended to consume the earth. Then came the first blast. A roar tore through the plain, shaking the mountains, making the rocks tremble, and shattering the silence with a force no one could withstand. Lot collapsed to his knees as he crossed the gates of Zoar. His daughters gasped for breath, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. There was no time to recover. From above, something began to fall. Not rain, not an ordinary storm. Fire tore through the sky like a blazing serpent devouring the heavens. Tongues of sulfur began to rain down upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The walls that had once defied time split like soft clay. The rooftops burst into flames in seconds. The plazas, where sin had ruled unchecked, were now glowing embers, consuming every corner. The ground shook with a thunder that cracked the streets open into molten crevices. The cries of the city rose in unison, but there was no escape left. From the heights above, the fury of heaven did not relent. Rivers evaporated before they could reach the earth. The houses, the temples, the palaces, everything collapsed in a storm of ash and flame. Lot did not look back. He knew Sodom no longer existed. The sky tore open with a blazing light. A deafening roar swept across the valley, shaking the mountains. Splitting the ground beneath the feet of those who still breathed in Sodom. From above, a storm of fire fell without mercy. Tongues of burning sulfur descended as if the sun itself had shattered, and its embers were raining down upon the city. The air became unbreathable, thick with unbearable heat. The water in the wells evaporated in seconds. Rooftops ignited before collapsing. The city walls cracked and crumbled as if made of ash. The streets that once echoed with music became fields of wailing. The people ran in all directions. there was no refuge to be found. The shadows of men stretched long in the fiery glow, only to vanish as the flames consumed them. The rivers that once flowed through the plain turned to steam, and the very ground began to open, swallowing what still stood. The plazas, where sin had become a way of life, now burned as a searing crucible, showing no distinction between noble and beggar. From a distance, Lot did not dare to look. He knew. Nothing remained. The wind carried ashes over Zoar. The night was not yet over, but the city that once shone with pride was now nothing more than a red glow on the horizon. The sky roared with a thunder that could not be ignored. The fire did not cease. Sulfur fell in blazing torrents, devouring everything in its path, and the air thickened with smoke that tore at the lungs. Sodom writhed in its agony. The towers that once reached defiantly toward the heavens collapsed in flames. The streets, where life once unfolded in luxury and excess, were now a maze of burning ruins. Screams rose from every corner, voices of terror, of pleading, of regret far too late. Desperate hands reached into emptiness, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Men who once boasted of their strength now lay on the ground, writhing in dust and ash. Some ran aimlessly, blinded by smoke, stumbling over bodies and rubble. Others fell to their knees, covering their faces with their hands, as if that could shield them from the judgment pouring down upon them. The entire city became an unending cry. The sound of despair merged with the crackling of stone melting beneath the fire. But the sky gave no answer. There was no voice to calm the storm, no hand to stay the wrath that had already been unleashed. From a distance, Zoar remained silent. The glow of Sodom still burned on the horizon, but the voices were beginning to fade. And when the last flame consumed the last shadow, all that remained was the echo of a lament lost in the wind. A thunderous crash shattered the early morning. The ground shook with a force no man could withstand. The walls that had protected Sodom for years began to crack, as if struck by the furious blow of an invisible giant. The tallest towers, those that once rose defiantly into the sky, began to tilt. Beams gave way, stones crumbled, and the air filled with the whistling rush of debris cascading to the ground. The plazas split open into deep chasms. The roads that once led to markets and palaces became gaping abysses that devoured everything in their path. The temples, where arrogance had replaced devotion, collapsed beneath the roar of fire and the weight of their own corruption. From Zoar, Lot felt the tremor beneath his feet. It was the voice of the earth answering the judgment of heaven. He did not dare look back. He knew that what was once a city was now an ocean of flame and dust. The last towers split in two before crashing down upon the ruins below. One after another, without exception, until the horizon was stripped bare, shrouded in thick smoke, red as blood. Fire consumed what little remained standing. The last columns of Sodom burned like torches amid a storm of ash. A reddish glow lit the valley with an otherworldly brilliance, while thick spirals of smoke rose, darkening the dawn. The streets that once pulsed with music and feasts were now rivers of molten ruin, where the heat devoured everything. Walls melted, doors turned to charcoal. Temples collapsed with a dry, echoing crash. The air, thick with sulfur, turned every breath into a burning blade. From a distance, Zoar remained silent. Lot and his daughters, their faces covered in dust and fear, watched as the horizon burned red. There were no cries for long. There were no prayers strong enough to halt the judgment. The flames rose like giant hands, reaching to claim what was left of the city. The plazas, the gardens, the golden palaces that once dazzled travelers, all vanished without a trace. The ground finally gave way. What had once been fertile land was now a smoldering wasteland of ash. The wind blew hard, sweeping away the last remnants of Sodom. Nothing was left standing. Nothing remained to tell its story. The wind swept across the plain, carrying ash and dust. Where walls once stood, now there was only a smoldering desert. Nothing survived the judgment that had fallen from the sky. Nothing. Except a solitary figure in the middle of the path. There she stood, motionless, her gaze fixed on the void. Lot's wife, transformed into a pillar of salt. Her white silhouette stood in stark contrast against the scorched earth, against a sky blackened by smoke, a body that no longer felt, eyes that no longer saw, a face frozen in the final instant of her mistake. Days would pass, years would cover her in desert dust, but her form would remain, a silent witness to what happens when the past weighs heavier than the future. There were no further warnings. The command had been clear: do not look back. But her heart still beat for Sodom, and in a single moment, she became part of the city she could not let go. Travelers who passed through that land would tell her story. Shepherds guiding their flocks would point to her shape, lost in solitude. But she would hear nothing. There would be no redemption, no return. Only the wind would go on blowing, eroding her form grain by grain, until the final trace of her disobedience dissolved into the dust of the earth. The wind blew fiercely atop the hill. Abraham stood still, his eyes fixed on the valley. His robes billowed with each gust, but he did not move. From where he stood, the horizon was veiled by a vast curtain of smoke. Only the day before, That valley had been a mosaic of green and gold, cut by rivers that mirrored the light of the sun. Now, all that remained was scorched earth. From his vantage point, he could still see the orange glow dancing over the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. Columns of fire rose like ghosts in the distance. His heart stirred. He remembered his plea, the supplication he had lifted to heaven, seeking mercy for those who dwelled in the city. But there had not been enough righteous. He pressed his lips together. Judgment had come. Nothing remained. The towers, the squares, the palaces, all reduced to ash. The sun began to rise slowly. Its light brought no hope, only illumination to the traces of destruction. Abraham lowered his head. He knew God does not make mistakes. He knew that every flame that consumed the city was deserved. Yet even with that understanding, the sight before him remained overwhelming. A land that had once been alive, now lay dead. The wind carried the scent of ashes. Abraham exhaled, closed his eyes for a moment, and descended the hill. The sun began to rise over the hills, but its light did not bring the dawn of a new day. The horizon was covered by a dark veil that climbed steadily upward. From afar, a column of smoke rose, a silent witness to what had taken place. It wasn't a passing breeze. It wasn't dust stirred by the wind. It was the breath of a city that no longer existed. The air was thick, heavy with ash. The valley, once fertile, had become a smoldering wasteland. The scorched and broken ground still burned beneath the weight of judgment. From above, Abraham watched in silence. He had pleaded for mercy. He had begged for the righteous amidst the wicked. But now the valley itself gave him the answer. Flames still writhed in the distance. The walls of Sodom had vanished without a trace. Everything that had once been a proud city now drifted through the air as dust and smoke. The wind blew, carrying the shadow of destruction across the land. The dark column rose beyond the mountains, as if the heavens themselves were forced to witness what remained on the earth. Abraham closed his eyes for a moment. There was nothing more to say. Judgment had been carried out, and the smoke of Sodom would rise until the last ember burned away. Abraham lifted his gaze to the sky. The stars once promised to him were still there, invisible in the daylight, yet as countless as when God had said, "So shall your descendants be." The judgment upon the cities of the valley had been righteous, but even in wrath, mercy had prevailed. Lot had been delivered. The line through which a great nation would rise still stood. God does not forget his promises. The land that had been foretold still waited for him and his offspring. His days would not end in the smoke of ruin, but in the fullness of an everlasting covenant. The sun continued to rise over the valley. Abraham drew a deep breath and kept walking. What he had seen would remain behind. What awaited him could never be taken away. Smoke continued to rise from the valley, darkening the horizon with a heavy shroud. Judgment had fallen, final and absolute. The streets of Sodom and Gomorrah, once filled with life, were now nothing more than ashes scattered by the wind. Abraham stood on the hillside watching. He had pleaded for the city, interceded until the last moment. But the judgment of God is not measured by the scales of men. Where corruption had ruled without restraint, fire had brought everything to an end. Yet even in wrath, mercy had moved. Lot was pulled from the destruction. He was given the chance to flee, to leave behind the place where his soul had been worn down by the wickedness of its people. God had extended his hand, but not all had taken it. Justice does not overlook evil, and mercy does not turn away from the righteous. Both had been revealed in a single night. The sun continued to rise over the scorched plain. The covenant with Abraham remained. The promises still waited to be fulfilled. Beyond the smoke, beyond the judgment, God had not turned away. The story was far from over. The sun lit the plain, but the earth remained dark. Smoke rose in thick spirals, blending with the sky like an eternal mourning. Sodom and Gomorrah no longer existed, but their story would not fade with the ashes. The cities that once stood in pride, filled with wealth and pleasure, were now dust scattered by the wind. No wall remained standing, no road led to them. The destruction had been complete. Travelers who passed through that valley turned their eyes away. The silence of the scorched earth spoke louder than any voice. The judgment that fell from heaven was etched into the memory of those who survived. Lot and his daughters continued on, but in their minds, the glow of the night when all was consumed still burned. Every time they closed their eyes, the echo of fire reignited in their thoughts. From the mountains, Abraham had watched the end of the cities. His intercession had not saved that place, but it had shown that God listens, that his justice is not blind, and his mercy is real. Years would pass, generations would rise and fall, but the tale of Sodom and Gomorrah would remain engraved in history, an unerasable memory, a testimony of warning, and in the scorched land, only the echo of a judgment no one would forget remained. The light of dawn had barely dispelled the shadow of destruction when Lot crossed the gates of Zoar. His feet were covered in dust, his breath was ragged. Beside him, his daughters followed in silence, their faces marked by the terror of the night they had just escaped. But the city that received them brought no relief. The inhabitants looked at them with suspicion. News of the fire that had fallen upon Sodom and Gomorrah was already spreading through the alleyways. Everyone knew Lot and his family were the only survivors. The atmosphere grew heavy. Suspicious glances, whispers in the dark. Zoar was small, but fear grew quickly. What if the judgment wasn't over? What if the fire came for them too? Lot felt a weight in his chest. He was not safe. The decision was made before the sun reached its highest point. He could not stay. He could not risk the fear of men turning into rejection, or worse, violence. Without a word, he took his daughters and left the city. The mountains rose in the distance, and there, among the shadows of the rocks, they would find refuge. The path was steep, but Lot did not stop. Each step took him farther from Zoar, and closer to the only safety he had left, the solitude of the mountains. The wind blew across the devastated plain. Sodom was behind him, Zoar too. Lot had no city, no wife, no land to call his own. Only the mountains remained, and the echo of all he had lost. The sun disappeared behind the mountains as Lot and his daughters reached the cave. The journey had been long, their bodies exhausted, but there was no other choice. Zoar was behind them, and the ruined plain was now just a memory, covered in dust and ash. The wind whistled between the rocks, filling the cavern with a cold murmur. There were no doors, no walls, no roof built by human hands. Only stone, shadow, and the emptiness of an uncertain future. Lot collapsed onto the rocky ground. His daughters watched him in silence. Fear still reflected in their eyes. They had lost their home, their mother, their city, and now they were here, far from everything, surrounded by the echo of the wind. The fire no longer burned on the horizon, but the weight of destruction still clung to them. The cave was no home, just an improvised shelter. A crack in the mountain where they could hide from a world that no longer wanted them. The man closed his eyes. Everything he once knew had vanished. The wealth of Sodom, the comfort of his life, the days when he never thought judgment would come. None of it remained. Only the sound of the wind, only the silence of a cave lost in the mountain. The cave was cold and dark. The fire of Sodom was behind them, but the shadow of loneliness wrapped around them. Lot's daughters watched their father in silence. The man who had once been a leader in the city was now only a ghost of what he had been. His eyes were empty, his body hunched under the weight of sorrow. He did not speak. He made no decisions. They too had lost everything. There was no home to return to, no relatives left, no path ahead. The mountain was their prison, and the cave their only refuge. Days passed, and fear gave way to anguish. The idea of a future faded like the echo of wind among the rocks. They looked at each other. If they did nothing, their lineage would vanish. Fear became a reckless thought. What the destruction had not consumed, desperation was about to. The fire of Sodom was behind them, but the weight of judgment still lingered over the cave where Lot and his daughters had taken refuge. The silence of the mountain became unbearable. There was no one left, no village to turn to, no man with whom to build a new family. Lot's daughters, gripped by the fear of being forgotten in that barren wilderness, made a desperate decision. Their lineage could not be allowed to vanish. In the shadows of the cave, their plan was carried out. They did not think of judgment. They did not consider the consequences. They saw in their father the only way to preserve their descendants, and they acted without pausing to consider the destiny they were sealing. As days passed, their bodies began to show signs of what had taken place. Two lives grew amid the silence. Time passed, and the children were born. The first was named Moab. From him would come a people who would settle the lands east of the Jordan. The second was called Ben-Ami. His descendants would become the nation of Ammon. The sons of Lot would grow, and their names would be etched into history. Two peoples who would rise, build cities, raise armies. But whose origin would always trace back to a cave hidden in the mountains. The wind still blew between the rocks. The judgment on Sodom had ended, but Lot's story had not yet closed its final chapter. The wind swept ashes across the land where once cities stood. Sodom and Gomorrah were gone, but their story would never be erased. From the mountain, Lot and his daughters were the last to see the smoke fade on the horizon. The streets that once overflowed with life were now only a memory. No walls remained, no gates. The plain, once fertile, had become a wasteland without a future. But the story of those cities did not end with their fall. Generations would repeat their names. The nations born from Lot's descendants would remember their origin. And throughout time, the memory of that judgment would be engraved on the conscience of the peoples. Kings who ruled the earth would hear the account of Sodom and Gomorrah. Prophets would speak of them as symbols of warning. Cities that filled themselves with corruption would know what awaited if they followed the same path. Nothing was left standing in that valley, but their story endured through the centuries, a legacy of justice, a warning written in fire and ash. The wind kept blowing, scattering dust across the plain, but the echo of judgment was never silenced.